What I'm trying to do is to look at the contribution that trade unions have made and why trade unions have made a contribution to social innovation, social entrepreneurship over the last 2 or 3 centuries. So my presentation is being carefully designed so that I am able to tell that story. I'm not a unionist. I'm a member of a trade union, but I wouldn't call myself a fan of a unionist. I've been a member of a union since in a previous place of employment. I was asked by my employer to sign myself out of the new rights that had been given to me under the Working Time Directive. The Working Time Directive goes back to somewhere 2003 to 2004, where it gives the requirement for employers to ensure that workers don't work for more than 72 hours a week over a 10-week period. Up until that point, there'd been no obligation on employers to measure the amount of time an employee was working. And the situation came up with, whereas my employer, who was an ethical social enterprise employer, my employer, which was an employee benefit trust, asked me to sign away my rights under the Working Time Directive so that they didn't have to measure the amount of time I was working over a 72-hour period. And I said no. That I didn't want to sign away new legal rights that I had acquired as an employee on the basis that it was too difficult for the employer to do. And it was out of that spat with my employer, who eventually agreed that their approach was not necessary, but it was out of that discussion with my employer that I became a member of a union. So I'm going to be saying much more today about my own personal positioning as a researcher. When you come to do your dissertations, you'll be asked to talk about your personal identity, your research identity. And that becomes particularly important when we're looking at sociological, historical work, helps us to understand why we've chosen the evidence we've chosen to present. So I'm going to be talking a bit more than I'd originally planned about my personal role in this. So the objective of this presentation is to look at, in the context of social innovation, in community organising, to look at the role of trade unions as a body of people, as a movement of people that would change and might change the world. And remember, I've talked to you before about change making as defined as something where someone spots a social problem and does something about it. Social innovation is where we see a social problem and we do something about it. It's as simple as that. Yesterday was a major strike by the underground workers. And today you'll see, as you come onto campus, you'll see that some of my colleagues are striking. And I think it's important for us to know what it is that union is saying. This is not me supporting or not supporting this, but just a question of fact. So off their own website, what we see, this is the argument of this particular union, is that vice-chancellors and principals of universities and colleges have had an average 5% increase in their salary, whereas the rest of the staff has had approximately 1%. Now, given that the retail price index, inflation in other words, has been running at 2 to 3%, you can see over a 5-year period, if you have only a 1% increase over a 5-year period, 1% per year, but prices are going up by 2 or 3% each year, that amounts to a pay cut. This union also says that there's £1 billion worth of reserves that universities own and colleges have control over. What they're using that reserve for, I don't know. The union doesn't tell us. And I'm sure they're using it for lots of different things. But the point is that's being made by this union is that that reserve could go into increasing the pay for lecturers, staff, cleaners, etc. And also that the Office of National Statistics, which is the most authoritative source of statistics in the UK, it's a government body, it tells people whether their statistics are robust enough. So you might have picked up on the news a week or so ago where the police forces have had their ONS status removed from their statistics because their statistics are not robust enough. So when we look at the Office of National Statistics' own statistics, then we can assume that they are as robust as you can possibly get. And they show that annual pay for full-time academic staff has remained stagnant. In other words, hasn't really changed since 2010. So those are the claims of the union at this particular time, in this particular place. And in London, we saw that a union has gone on a day-long strike over the removal of manned tickets offices across London in the Underground, and what should happen to the staff, and whether having ticket offices is an important aspect of using the tube. So it's right and worthy for us to think at the moment, in the middle of at least 2 or 3 different sets of strike action, to think about what does strike action mean, what is a union, to go back and not just assume that we understand unions equal striking, and understand what else is going on. And it asks the question, I wonder what unions have actually done for us. I don't know, have you all seen the clip on Life of Brian, What Have the Romans Done for Us? If not, I'll put it on the Nile site. Basically, it's a set of revolutionaries, and it's a film about where a set of Palestinian revolutionaries in Jesus' time are having an argument about what the Roman occupation has done for them. And of course, the Roman occupation has brought roads, it's brought trade, it's brought lots of things, but they're still against the Roman Empire. And in a sense, particularly in the 21st century, we find a lot of people saying, well, what's the point of a union? Why do we have unions? What have unions done for us? And if we look at a very partial list of the sorts of things that unions have achieved over the last century, just having a weekend, having 2 days at the end of a week rather than 1 day. There's always been, in the Judeo-Christian world at least, having 1 day off a week, either on a Saturday or a Sunday, depending whether you're Jew or a Christian, but having that second day off is an innovation. It's new. It's quite new in historical terms. So actually, even in the 1860s in America, trade unions and labour organisations were arguing that actually having 2 days off a week was an important thing. Having pay during your lunch break rather than not being paid during your 1 hour lunch break is something that I'm sure we'd all be quite happy or quite sorry to lose, but that has been something that unions have created. Having workplace pensions rather than paying for yourself. So historically, when you finished working, when you were too old to work, you weren't paid any further money by your employer. If you'd saved up money, that was fine. But up until the workplace pensions were implemented, there was no obligation on your employer to actually help you to retire and help you to live when you retire. First, it was something that churches and charitable organisations did, and then unions got involved, and then it became a state pension after the Second World War. Health and safety. We all are assuming that the place that we come to is safe, and that we're not asked to do anything that's unsafe. But there's no, until the unions required it during the 1890s, there was no obligation for unions, for employers, to provide safety equipment. Indeed, during the coal mining expansion in South Wales in the 1840s to 1860s, the employers would sell safety equipment to their employees from company shops, and they would basically make a profit, a premium price, out of the safety equipment. It wasn't paid for free. And the Truck Acts of the 1870s removed that obligation and made sure that employers actually provided simple things like safety equipment. And you think, well, that's the end of it. But actually, my own experience in Scotland in the 2004-2006 period, where I was working with Eastern European labour, in fish and food processing factories in the northeast of Scotland, we established that the personal protective equipment that the employees were required by law to wear were being sold by the employers to the employees. So they were not being provided for free. And of course, the employers were making a profit on selling that equipment, that personal protective equipment, to their employees. Because they were agency staff, they didn't think that it was necessary to provide health and safety equipment as standard. Even the right not to be sacked for being ill or pregnant, because very often we find that being pregnant is considered to being ill, in law and in society. But it's only quite recently that you have had the right not to be sacked, in other words, not to be made redundant because you are ill or pregnant. It would be interesting to see what would happen if we went back to a situation where you as employees could be just made redundant because you're ill or pregnant. Or the end of child or slave, indentured labour, became up through churches and charities, but also trade unions have also been a part of that. Trade unions in their history came from guilds and trades, where people would come together to protect their rights. I'm going to finish that list and then I'm going to come back to the history of trade union and guilds within Northampton and in the county. Working together to set pay and ensure safe working conditions. So setting pay and establishing who should be paid and whether it's possible to pay a person who does one task in one company differently to a person who does the same task in a different part of the country or even indeed a different part of the world. Or even lower pay for women. We still haven't got to the point where women are paid an equal amount compared to the men in the same jobs. But at least having a political and a legal commitment to equal pay is something that trade unions have implemented and got implemented. Even the end of apartheid, the trade unions were very much behind the anti-apartheid and anti-discrimination, anti-segregation rules, both in America and in South Africa. Not on their own. They did it as part of churches, they did it as part of community groups, they did it as part of a social movement, as part of social innovation. But certainly trade unions have been part of that process. We discussed, I think, last term about when was the national minimum wage implemented. Can you remember when we got a national minimum wage? 2005, 2006, yes. But when we talked about it last year in class, we thought, oh, national minimum wage had always been there, maybe since the start of the welfare state in the 40s and 50s, and definitely not. But again, with the national minimum wage or even the living wage campaign that's going on at the moment, first developed by churches and charities and community groups, and then picked up by trade unions, and then picked up by the political parties. And even a state-funded university education. That universities in their history were private institutions paid for by individuals. Charitable money was used, philanthropic money was used to give scholarships, etc. But since the 1940s, state-funded education has been part of our political scene until 1996, where the cost of university was started to be shifted onto you as students. And 1996, remember, that was the year before the new Labour government. And even through the new Labour government, student loans and student top-up fees were part of the political field. So it's not necessary that you have to be left-wing to be pro-state education. But from 1996, increasingly the who of paying for your university education has shifted from the general population to you as individuals. So we can see that this is just a very short list of the sorts of things that unionism and employees working together, let's say, are able to create, the conditions that are able to create in their places of employment. The sorts of things that we kind of take for granted. The history of trade unionism in Northamptonshire, for example, also tells us something about social innovation and social entrepreneurship. What is this county historically known for? Shoemaking. Do you only know how shoemaking was done in the 1870s? If you go into the Victorian parts of Northampton, the red brick housing areas in the centre of and outside the centre of Northampton, you'll find that at the end of each house, at the end of the garden, is a stone shed, a brick shed. And in many cases, these were individual workshops where people would work in their houses and they would work as individual craftspeople. And the majority of the shoemaking from this area was being used to supply the military, the campaign against Napoleon, for example. But what was the purchasers were doing was buying from an individual their shoes. So you're producing 10 shoes a day, and I'm going to buy them from you for 3 shillings and 6pence. But my friend over there can actually provide me 11 shoes a day for 3 shillings dead, not the 6pence, so 6pence cheaper. So what I'm going to do is buy the shoes from you rather than you, and you get no contract from me whatsoever. Is that fair? Well, it's capitalism, isn't it? Because if I can get more shoes for cheaper, of course I would go and get more shoes for cheaper. The fact that you have now got to work 17 hours in a day to produce that, whereas you are working 12 hours a day, that's capitalism, isn't it? That's how the rules of the game work. So what happened was that the individual shoemakers started to come together and say, well, actually, if we group together, first we can afford better equipment because we can invest our income together, and then we can also say, well, no, you're not going to trade me off against the person living next door to me. We're going to have the same price because we are doing the same thing. We're making shoes, aren't we? Well, these are not better shoes or worse shoes or bigger shoes or smaller shoes or shiny shoes versus dull shoes. These are the same boots that are being provided to the army. So they started coming together and created a guild and then established one of the first social enterprises because it was involving the workers themselves in the decision making, and they created a cooperative effectively, and this was an area where there was hundreds of cooperatives, workers working together and creating companies effectively so that they could work in groups to share the investment, to share the risk, and to share in the rewards. So we can see even this county itself has a history of social innovation, of people coming together to create cooperatives as trades. There's no other reason for them to come together except their trade is making shoes and making leather. So in order to understand why we have trade unions, why we find that people who are workers come together in groups in order to have better control over their working environment, we need to have a dig into the way in which capitalism works. So there's quite a lot going on in this slide, but it's a kind of a step-by-step kind of thumbnail sketch of an understanding, a particular way, of thinking about capitalism, thinking about capital. Now, stepping outside and talking about my researcher identity, I would suggest that my research identity is very similar to a very good friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Rory Ridley-Duff in Sheffield Hallam. And his work is mostly about cooperatives. And the way he describes cooperatives is that they are anti-capitalist but not anti-market. Okay, so I would say that I am anti-capitalist but not anti-market. So I don't believe that we should stop trading and stop having businesses and stuff like that. But we understand capital has some contradictions in it, and we need to address these contradictions. And I'll explain as we go on why I think this understanding is important for social innovation. At the start, what I'm saying is capitalism, capital, relies on... There's a question. On the previous slide, go on then. Oops.
Yeah, that having paid breaks does that not limit the workers' right?
Does it limit? Does having paid lunch breaks limit the workers' rights?
To an extent, yeah.
I suppose it could do, but on the other hand, if I was to employ you and not pay you for lunch hour, but I was going to make you take a lunch hour because it's my legal obligation to make you take a break. Okay, but I'm not going to pay you for that lunch break. So rather than being paid for 8 hours a day, you're going to be at my place of work for 8 hours, but you only get paid for 7.
Yeah, but what if I'm on my break, which is a paid break, and then you call me to go and do my job?
Yes, I can't do that because it's a paid lunch break.
Yeah, but you have that right again.
Yes.
Call me off my lunch.
I don't have a right. No, as an employer, I would not have a right to call you off your lunch. I have to wait until your lunch hour is finished. But what's interesting is, particularly nowadays, the norm is not to take a lunch break. Yeah, you work through your lunch, or you're doing emails or something, you eat on the fly or whatever, but the legal obligation is there. It could be limiting for you as an employee, saying, I'd rather get on and finish my work and go home early, but I've got to take a lunch break. So that can be a limitation, yes. Going back to the capital slide, so what we're looking at, I'm going to try and do is just kind of very briefly establish what a lot of people, and I'm going to go through each of these writers, what they think is the problem with capitalism. This is not a personal thing. This is not about kind of individual businesses or individual organisations. This is about the kind of structure, the rules of society, the behaviours of society that we call capitalism. So capitalism relies on, first thing, is something that Karl Marx pointed out, a surplus of labour. So what happens is that it's really important to have extra people available. So if one of my employees, or if a group of employees stop working, I can replace them. So in my shoe making example, I relied on having a surplus of labour, because if you two got together and said, no, we're going to charge the same, I can always rely on the 90% of you who are not part of this group to actually trade against these two who've come together in a cooperative. So it relies on the idea that there's always another employee that will step into the breach. So if you misbehave as an employee, or you refuse to do something as an employee, I can always get another employee somewhere in the country or even in the world. Okay, so we can, in the 80s, for example, where a lot of manufacturing industry left Britain and went to China, that you see the same sort of idea. It's too expensive, goes the logic, to have our factory in Britain because employment rights are too great and too expensive. Therefore, we'll go to China or Asia where there are less employment rights and it's cheaper, and therefore we can always rely on someone somewhere else in the world. Now, it's interesting, as Chinese and Asian labour gets more expensive, whether that shift of industry will shift to the Russias, to the Slavic-speaking countries, or whether that will shift to Latin America, or whether it will shift to the African countries. So it will be interesting to see. But in the heart of it, says Karl Marx, is that this notion of unemployment. That actually capital relies on there being unemployed people who will need a job, and therefore make sure that the people who are employed are compliant employees. And this is what Karl Marx says, amongst lots of other things. I'm just picking out one idea from him. He also says that the people who are creating these factories and investing money are also receiving money, more money from the value of their products than the worker receives. It's known as profit or surplus. And for capital, that's a good thing. I've got money, I'm going to invest money, I want to have more money back when I finish, because there's no point. But for workers, you're making a bunch of shoes for 3 shillings and 6pence, okay, and I'm going to sell them for 5 shillings. So I've made a profit. Now, what I've basically done is you've done 5 shillings worth of work to produce those pair of boots, but you only get 3 shillings and 6pence. And there's a separation, therefore, between myself, who owns capital, who has money that can invest, and you, you've invested your time. You might have gone and made another pair of boots that are more valuable, but no, you've made those pair of boots for me. So you've invested some of your time for free, some of your resources for free, but you haven't been paid for them. So that's what Karl Marx says, that underlies all of capitalism, relies on this basic contradiction, that I'm going to get you to do something, I'm going to pay you some money for it, but I'm not going to pay you all of the value that comes out of it. Now, a shilling doesn't make a lot of difference to us. But if you say a company makes 10% profit or a 500% profit, you can then start to say, well, why is it that the workers get 500% less? I'm going to be careful there because the maths doesn't really work. But why would the workers get so much less than the product being paid for? So in international, global terms, we might ask the question, why is it we pay, I don't know, £300-400 for a mobile phone, but the people making the mobile phones in Asia might receive £10 for that mobile phone, for their work and their skills put into it? So the other thing that comes out of it, work by Stiglitz in 1987, for example, is this notion of dividing and ruling. So what's important is that we have a principal-agent relationship. This is what Stiglitz talks about in his work, the difference between a principal and an agent. So I've got the money, so therefore I'm the principal, and you're my agent, and actually what I need to do is control you. I need to manage you somehow in order to make sure that I get the most profit out of you. And I can't do that for hundreds of you, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to hire managers to manage that for you. Now, until Henry Ford started building cars, that didn't really exist. An entrepreneur was someone who actually directly related to their customer. They created a piece of craft, and therefore they sold it directly to the person buying. But what we're starting to see is the growth of very big organizations where you'd have a principal like myself with money. I would pay money into a company and managers would manage you as employees. And then there's a separation because what the managers are, they are employees. Okay? They don't own the money, but they become representatives of the people with money. And therefore, their job is to control the workers, and they've become separate from the workers themselves. And I've worked as an employee, I've worked as a manager, I've worked as a capitalist myself in all of those areas. So those tensions between what I want to achieve as a leader of an organization compared to what my employees want to achieve can be very different. And sometimes what we do is put a manager in between, so that they manage the work on my behalf, and creates a separation in the employees, a separation that's not existed before in society. So that's why Stiglitz talks about it. It's not natural for us to have a separation between managers and workers. It's something that's been created to serve this idea of capitalism. Another example of the way in which the thing that capitalism relies on is this notion of fictitious money. Karl Marx talks about it, but I would also pick up on David Harvey's work in 2006. Now, David Harvey was one of the third wave and third way theorists. He was a critical social theorist. He would be considered to be Marxian. He's not a Marxist, but a Marxian. One of the big problems with Karl Marx as a theorist is he talks about the contradictions of capitalism in 19th century Britain, but he doesn't say anything about what the future should look like. He criticizes the now, but never says very much about what the future should hold. And he gets confused with communists, for example. So communists are people, particularly Leninists and Stalinists, are Marxists who go and deliver a type of Marxism in Russia and in the Slavic-speaking countries, and therefore we get communism as we know it, Stalin-Leninism as an example. But there are lots of other Marxisms around the world that we can explore. The communism in China, for example, is very different from the communism that we find in Russia. The communism that was prevalent in the 1960s and 1970s in the Middle East was also a very different Islamically informed communism. In the same way as the communism in Africa and in Latin America was very different. Even, dare I say it, the communism that was present in America in the 1930s, until it became un-American to be communist in America. So David Harvey is a Marxist or Marxian writer, but he's not a classical Marxist. And he takes his work on a bit further, and I'll come back to Gramsci in a moment. But what he says, and the example of this is of fictitious money, is where we start to buy and sell things that don't really exist. Okay, so we sell boots. We understand buying and selling of boots. That's a really important thing. We can see them, we have them on our feet, and there's something valuable to that. But in the history of companies, something significantly shifts when companies are allowed to sell shares. And that's not normal in history terms, for me to be able to sell a share of my business. Because what I'm doing is I'm not selling boots, I'm not selling an object, I'm selling a future of my company. What I'm saying to you is you want to buy some shares in my boot-making company, you are basically taking a bet that your 10 shillings worth of shares is going to be worth 100 shillings in the future. And it was a change of law by the government in the 1780s that allowed people to sell shares onto one another. So you buy a share from me for, say, 10 shillings of my company. So you give me 10 shillings so I can make more boots. Okay? And then you say, actually, now that my company has grown bigger, my share is worth 20 shillings, I'm going to sell my share off to somebody else, and they can own a bit of my company, but they're not going to pay any more money to me. So when somebody else in the class buys the shares from them, the money doesn't come back to me as a company, you've made the profit. Okay? You've sold a fictitious good, you've sold a future benefit. Now, you say, well, I think that Tim's company is going to be really successful, and in the future his shares are not going to be worth 20 shillings, they're going to be worth 200 shillings. And therefore, you will then sell your shares off at a greater price. It gets even more complicated than that. During the 1990s, people were actually selling bets that the share value would go down. And they're also selling the same bet that the share value would go up. So they're actually starting to sell bets on share capital. So I would come along and say to you, right, you've got some shares. I'm going to sell you the option that your shares will increase in value. And then I'll come and say to you, I'm going to sell you an option that his shares will decrease in value. So if his shares decrease in value, you make a profit. If his shares increase in value, he makes a profit. And I'll take a fee from both of you. Can you see how that starts to become completely fictitious? There's no money changing hands. And then what we find that what was happening in America in 2007 and 8 was people were encouraged to buy money, very, very cheap money, in order to buy their houses. It was important for people to have houses and to own their own houses. Even if you were unemployed, you could buy a house. Even if there was no way that you could ever repay, someone was willing to lend you money in order to buy a house. Okay? So it got as bad as that. I would just lend you money because I was being encouraged to sell debt, selling mortgages. That's fine, as long as the increase in value of the house keeps pace. Okay, so my house is worth £40,000 1 year, and 5 years later it's worth £70,000. Even if I can't personally afford to pay the mortgage, the house is worth more for the person who actually owns it, the bank. So everything keeps on going. So that's fine, as long as house prices keep on increasing, as they did throughout the 1990s. And then suddenly people started thinking, oh dear, I wonder what happens if people stop being able to pay their mortgages. If they stop paying their mortgages, I have to sell the house off cheap. And therefore I'm not going to get all of my money back. I might get 90% of my money back or 50% of my money back. What I'm going to do is I'm going to bundle all of those problem mortgages together with good mortgages, and I'm going to sell them off as a lump. So I'm going to mix people who are likely to default on their mortgage with people who are good and not going to default, and I'm going to sell that off as a profit. And I'm going to tell people that's a really good debt to buy, a really profitable debt, even though there's some bad debt involved in that. Then people started noticing that these fictitious bonds that were being sold weren't quite as good as they should be. So they started selling those bonds off really quickly to get rid of dangerous debt. And of course, what that meant was that people stopped buying houses, people could stop paying their mortgages, people defaulted on their mortgages, and this was only, I don't know, a few thousand people in North America that started the global crash. But as people started to go, house prices are not increasing anymore, I can't get my money back, then they started foreclosing on mortgages and saying, you can't pay your mortgage, I'm going to take your house away from you. And then suddenly there was a massive rash of people foreclosing on mortgages, and then suddenly you had this rollout of the bad debt throughout the world. So what we can see from this is what Harvey says is this buying and selling of fictitious goods, in other words, debts, bets on debts and stuff like that, where most of the increase in value over the 1990s to late 2000s, most of the economic value had come from selling these fictitious debts. Once we stop believing in them, they disappear and they become toxic. But what capitalism relies on is the ability to go and sell futures. This is not something invented in the late 20th century. One of the earliest boom and bust crashes was where people had been sold in Victorian Britain shares for a company that they were not being told what was going on. They were told that they were going to get 600% or more profit on their project, on their shares, but they weren't being told what the project was, what the company was going to do. But people were actually buying it because they thought that shares would always increase in value. So there's a share issue for a venture that was secret. And people bought the shares for this venture that was kept secret. And then, of course, then there was no venture. It was then it collapsed. Not just money. So Karl Marx and Stiglitz and Harvey will talk mostly about money and the flows of economics. And Karl Marx's criticism of capital is about money. But in the 60s and 70s, there's a shift in the way in which people think about capitalism. particularly out of a work by a guy in the 1930s called Gramsci, though the date is 71. He lived in the 1930s. He was an Italian communist. And one of his critiques about the problems of capitalism was not just about money, it's about culture. So the money is a measure of the relationships that I've just been describing. So what Gramsci says is that actually if you look at the relationships between people, the separation between people, the selling of fictitious goods, the fictitious value, the betting and stuff like that, that's actually a culture. It's not just money, it's a culture. And alongside him, the French philosopher Michel Foucault, picking up similar threads, talks about the use of control and power. So the control of the principal over the agent, the control of the person with the money over the people working. An example of this is that it doesn't really happen nowadays, but for a long time in British history, if you retired, you were given a clock, a nice carriage clock, gold and glass and stuff like that. Does anyone know why you were given a clock as a retirement gift? It's a nice thing to have, but actually what it signified was giving you your time back. Because the first people to implement clocks as a way of controlling people were the factories. The factories would have a whistle at the start of the day, like the school bell, in order to call the people who lived in a village to make sure they were at work on time. And the only reason they want to know exactly what the time is because they need to know how many hours that their workers have created. So when you were an employee, you lived on the company time. You clocked in, you clocked out. You'd actually turn up to university or turn up to work and put your card in a slot and it would click it, make sure you're there, and then when you'd finished work, you clicked it and you left. And the giving of the clock actually signified, now it's your time. You can do what you want with your time. We no longer own your time. So that's an example of a piece of culture that expresses the contradictions, the problems within capitalism. We also, skipping a bit further on now, we find in globalized world that actually some companies are bigger than governments. So the company Visa has more money and more employees than Zimbabwe. It's worth more than the whole of the Zimbabwean economy. So we have organizations, we have companies now that are bigger than their states. Now the history of companies used to be that the only people allowed to trade was the country, was the king. And the king would give a commission and give the rights to trade to certain individuals in Parliament. So to create a company, you'd have to go to Parliament to get permission to start a company. The East India Trading Company is a classic example of private individuals working alongside the government and the king in order to do trading. And it's only in the 1930s that it became easier and easier to set up a company. And nowadays, if you want to set up a company, you just go on the internet and you can buy a company for about £25, ready set up. Okay, it's incredibly easy to start a company. You don't have to change the law to create a company. And that means that actually these companies are now not part of the state. They're separate from the state. And we can see that much more now. We see Nike and Microsoft, etc., being, if you treated them as countries, much, much bigger than many countries and much more money, much more financial influence. So if you think of, it's often thought of as Microsoft employees as being micro-serfs, micro-slaves. And if you think of all the Microsoft employees across the world, if they think of themselves as being employees of Microsoft more than they are citizens of Zimbabwe, let's say, their political affiliation, their social affiliation is to Microsoft, not to the country, you can see that there's a contradiction. There's a problem there, isn't there? So we have an issue where some organizations are so huge that they're much bigger than the countries that created them. And then finally, picking up on work of Paulo Freire, which we've already talked about, we find that the workers become silenced by these vulnerabilities. The workers don't speak out because of these sorts of contradictions. It's the norm, it's the culture, it's the expression of power, it's the economic power that people have that keep workers silent. And I personally could also contrast my own personal position, actually comes partly, I think, from Gramsci's work as a Euro-communist, but also from the work of Catholic social teaching. And I've picked up on Pius X, for example, the Pope in the 1930s, who was one of, there's about 15, 20 different documents from the Catholic Church that express a critique of capitalism. And Pius X's work in the 1930s, after the 1914-1918 war and the crash and the rise of communism, Pius X is also criticising capitalism. And my own religious tradition is Russian Orthodoxy, and I would also look to people like St. John of Kronstadt, for example, in the city of Kronstadt near St. Petersburg, who, when there was massive unemployment, was employing 40,000 people himself in his parish, 40,000 people being employed in his parish. So unions have done it all, haven't they? They've fixed the world. The world's a better place because of unions. Well, here's a few examples of it where the social innovations that have come from unions are not yet in place. Buying brands of shoes contributes to child labour. Just don't do it. That's a UNICEF programme. A picture of a young boy in chains working as indentured labour in China, I think that's from. Also, 17 million children in India still have to go to work rather than to school. And what are the implications of that? And particularly, largest proportion of them are girls who have to work, because it's much more valuable for a boy to be educated in many African countries, and therefore the boy's education will be privileged over girls' education. So they still have to go to work. But we thought that unions had got rid of child labour and indentured slavery. We look at unemployment. This is examples from the Office of National Statistics there. You can see where that information comes from. Looking from the 1980s through to 2012. And the amount of unemployment you can see peaks in 1985 and in 1990, and then unemployment drops throughout the 1997 to 2008 period when you have a left-wing government in place that's dedicated to try to reduce the amount of unemployment, reduce the pool of available labour. But then in 2007 and 2008, that unemployment goes back up again. Not as much as back in the 1980s under the Thatcher period, but certainly much more significant than during the 2000s. And that kind of gives us an example. It's not easy just to say, oh, well, the government was and therefore this created unemployment. I'm not suggesting that. But what we're able to see is the higher that peak is, the more available labour there is, the more vulnerability there is for people who work, because there are more than enough other people to do the work. And that nowadays touches very much on immigration and refugee status, where immigrants and refugees are being demonised because they are seen as a spare labour, an extra labour that's coming to take away the opportunities. Because what you don't want is more and more people in the labour market, because that makes the existing employees more and more vulnerable. In America, did you know pregnant women have been fired for drinking water, or using the bathroom too frequently, or because they are unable to lift heavy objects? And there are people still in America who are being sacked because their employment rights in America are much, much less than we have here in the UK. So you can be fired and hired whenever at will and with very little control. So if you get pregnant and you're no longer able to lift those heavy weights, you're fired, or can be fired. This is from the Daily Mail. I'm not usually a Daily Mail reader, but I thought it was a very good example of health and safety. We thought we had fixed health and safety and that the world was a much safer place. And here are some people working on refurbishing a block of flats in Korea, North Korea. And you can see that they're being held on. There's no scaffolding. There's a net that helps them if they fall off. And it looks like that they are being... each of them has a belt round their waist. They're up a block of flats. There's a belt, piece of rope attaching them to the wood, not to the building, but to the wood of the scaffolding, as they refurbish a block of flats. Or environmental pollution. Here we have an example of Trafigura, a multinational company behind the dumping in 2006 of toxic waste in the Ivory Coast, Côte d'Ivoire, in Abidjan, an example. Or even the bottom side is a pelican being slowly killed by oil pollution from a oil platform in the in the Gulf of Mexico in one of the oil spills. So we have vast amounts of environmental legislation now. That's what I spent 15 years doing, was working in environmental law and environmental activism. We have made enormous changes, but by no means are we all there. Does that mean that our environment is good in the UK and therefore it's okay just to say, we don't need environmental laws anymore, we don't need environmental activists anymore? So that's a history or a kind of a context of the role of trade unions within significant changes within society. I've given you some slides about a slide about the why of trade unionism, why labour workers might come together to make changes in their environment, because people within who have greater power or greater money than them are able to make more important and more powerful decisions. So as organisers, as communities come together, as communities of bootmakers or communities of meat packers come together, we find that they are able to exercise greater power than the individual. So what relevance does this have to enterprising communities? Well, last term we were already looking at the organisers of communities, the way in which communities, not trades, but communities themselves, are often excluded from places of power and places of decision making in order to make certain behaviours acceptable or not acceptable. We talked about Barack Obama, for example, using community organising exercises and activities and techniques to actually win an election, to be the first African or black president in the USA. So what we've already created within this module is this idea that of communities coming together to change and to innovate socially. And I've already presented to you this three-part definition of social innovation versus social entrepreneurship versus social enterprise. So social innovation are the ideas, the creativity that comes from changing the way in which societies work. We can look at that last term as communities doing it, but in this talk I'm talking about communities of trades, people who are like each other because of the job they do or because of the skills that they have, coming together to change the way in which the world works. And then social entrepreneurship is the processes whereby they get that delivered. So it could be changing the law. It could be having a strike. It could be having a demonstration. It could be at least sitting down and having a good conversation with employers and persuading employers that it's a good thing to do. An example of employers saying employer rights is a good thing would be our favourite chocolate manufacturer. Has anyone got a favourite chocolate manufacturer? Cadbury's, thank you very much. Exactly one I was thinking of. Okay, Cadbury's built, not Cadbury World, but before that, Bourneville in Birmingham. It was the first place, not the first, one of an example of people running very large factories who actually said, it's in our best interest to have our employees living and working in healthy, safe houses and to be educated. So he built Bourneville as a model village with new housing rather than the slums that were there before, with a roof over your head, with sewage, proper sewage, with reduced numbers of people living in houses. So the slums at that point would have had several families living in one room. It happens today with Eastern Europeans, several people living in one room, sleeping in shifts. So it's not completely gone. But to educate and to feed your employees was part of what Cadbury's did as an employer. So it wasn't just a question of we've got to do it because the workers want us to do it, but actually this is a good thing to do because it means that our employees are better, healthier, better educated, better skilled, and therefore we get more profit, we get better conditions for everybody, and really good chocolate. So the processes of social entrepreneurship for Cadbury's was actually creating a company that included the employees in it, and to actually invested in their buildings, invested in their education. Now this isn't just Bourneville. My own work in China showed how, and I'll show you the publication at the end, but my own work, investigations in China, showed that social entrepreneurship wasn't invented in the 1990s in China, that there's been hundreds of years of history of organizations providing all of the social conditions that were necessary. So in a university in China, before communism and under communism in China, if you worked for a university, you had children, your children were educated by the university, you had a university car, if there was a car at the time, you had a university doctor and a dentist, and if you were sick, you went to the university hospital and stayed in the university hospital. They would organise social events for you. Okay, it's very difficult to move to a different company or different organisation, but as an employer, they looked after all of your social welfare. It wasn't provided by the state, it was provided through your place of employment. Good housing, good transport, good food, good healthcare, good education. All of that provided by the employer themselves. So it's not just a British thing for Bourneville, it was something that, for example, China would do. And then social enterprise is the organisation that comes out of processes of social innovation and social entrepreneurship. So it's the venture. It could be a charity, it could be a cooperative, it could be a standard business, it doesn't matter what. And I've picked up here again that the resource centre that we're using, the examples of lots of these types of things are being housed in the Changemaker website, because the Changemaker is not just about social enterprise, it's about the wider field of making the world a better place, spotting a social problem and doing something about it. But I, as a researcher, have been part of the world of social enterprise and social innovation long before I came to the University of Northampton. And I've always come from what is known as a critical theory perspective. I'm, broadly speaking, in theoretical terms, I would say I was kind of Gramscian, Foucauldian sort of influences. And I'll explain why that is. So my commentary here is about the bit at the end. And I've always said, right from the word go, that our interest in social enterprise is a little bit problematic. We need to look carefully. Now, I'm a great fan of social enterprise, but I'm also a critical fan, a critical friend, as it were, of social enterprise and social entrepreneurship. So I'm not just standing here in front of classes talking about social innovation and social entrepreneurship like I'm some sort of cheerleader. Okay, I don't wear short dresses and wave a pom-pom around, as American cheerleaders might. I'm very enthusiastic about it, but I'm also critical. And my work in this university, outside the university, before I came to this university, has all been about a critique and making sure that we take a long, careful look at these ideas of social entrepreneurship. Our job as professionals, as critical community development workers, as academics, is to look carefully and coolly and critically at the things that we see in front of us. So, for example, social enterprises in the UK has been a massively contested term. There is no definition of what a social enterprise is or isn't. In Italy, there are two types of legal frameworks for social enterprises. In Poland, there is one type of organisation that's called a social enterprise. In America and in Britain, all sorts of community organisations and trading organisations can call themselves a social enterprise. There are 17 different legal forms for running a business. So all of those could be a social enterprise. But what we find when you look at the policy making, we find that the policy makers focus on one particular type of organisation called a community interest company and say that's a social enterprise and we're going to fund that. So there was a new policy discussion had over the last couple of days from people who are interested in financing social enterprises. And the person, the MP talking about it, talked primarily about community interest companies. And what I'm trying to say is, actually, we've got to keep our mind open. There's lots of ways in which we can deliver social enterprise and social entrepreneurship, not just a community interest company or a simple organisation. We've got industrial and friends provenance organisations that created the first banks. We've got cooperatives. You've probably all bought from the cooperative one way or the other, but not thought of it as being a community organised, a community-owned organisation. Cooperative shop, cooperative insurance, etc. I've also said in other places that social enterprises also have to have a mission to their people, to the people they employ, not just a mission outside. So you'll see in your handbook, in the Unit 1 of your handbook, I talk explicitly about the social innovation that can happen inside an organisation, the internal mission of an organisation, as well as the shapes and types of external mission that an organisation should have. So every organisation, I have argued before, must contain an element of internal social mission as well as an external social mission. There's no point me running a social enterprise that solves water problems in Africa if I then go and use child labour from China to do so. Can you see the contradiction in that? If I've got employees who have no pensions and can't take a lunch break, or I'm sacking women because they've got pregnant, while I'm trying to make the life of Africans better by giving them clean water, there's a fundamental contradiction in that organisation. The definition of change-making itself is not an invention of this university, it's an invention of Ashoka in the 1980s and Bill Drayton. Includes the voice of those people who benefit, including employees and other stakeholders. So social entrepreneurship is intrinsically about the stakeholders that are involved, the communities that we benefit. So we've talked already about how do you get the people who benefit from our social goods and social activity involved in creating those social goods. And we've talked, for example, about my project with the police, working with community groups to get them involved in creating safety in their communities, not just waiting for the police to come along and do it for them. And I've talked in a number of other places, in 2006, 2007, in 2008, 2012. Those are published presentations or in published work, where social enterprises on the whole, not all of them, but social enterprises have to work within the rules of capitalism because they're businesses, they're enterprises. Now, I've worked in an environmental social enterprise, and sometimes we manage to change behaviours and change the rules of society, change the rules of capitalism, not personally, but as a group of environmentalists, we have been able to change the law so that when you put something in the bin, it costs as much for that bin to be emptied as it is to be thrown away. Whereas before the 1990s, I'll come to you in a second, before the 1990s, it was very cheap to throw stuff away because you didn't have to pay for the environmental pollution. Whereas under the landfill tax, you now have to pay, or the university and you in your rates have to pay the real environmental cost of throwing your waste away, encouraging you to recycle. You're going to ask a question.
Just to make comments on that social enterprise will exist within the rules of capitalism.
Yes.
I mean, that's the reason why capitalism has survived up to this day, because if you look at the previous slide, we're talking about managers.
Yeah.
The managers are employees.
Yes.
But what the business people will do is that they will raise your salary, and then you no longer see yourself as an employee,
Yeah.
but you see yourself as part of the owners of the business. So what happens is that those who are not involved, you are no longer part of them. So you have to move from the slum and go to the richer estate.
Yes.
So this problem of enterprise.
It's fascinating even within social enterprises. Some of the big social enterprises where they're not owned by capitalists, okay? But actually you still get a division between people who are operating for the benefit of the company and then employees who are constructed as being different. So you even still get agents, senior leaders who pay themselves lots of money. It's fine, I'm not going to criticise that, but they pay themselves so much more than their employees that they start to see themselves as quasi-capitalists. They're separate from their organisation or separate from their employees. So even when you don't have capitalists controlling an organisation, the behaviours and norms of capitalism get included in. I'm not going to cite any examples because I wouldn't want to criticise individual companies, but you can look at social enterprises and ask yourself the question, to what extent are the employees separating themselves into leaders or bosses and workers rather than working together. Yeah?
Yeah. Yeah, but you see, that is the problem. You know, because, I mean, if you take when conservative came back to power, I mean, they had all these nice speeches and everything, and then they won the heart of the people.
Yes.
And today, when you look at them, they are being criticized all over the place.
Yeah.
So this problem is an ongoing problem. And it's the same with the social enterprise.
Yeah.
And they have all these nice ideas, but the sooner they start having these big salaries, then they sort of separate themselves from the problems. And the problem is still there.
Although I would say, if we go back to our slide about Marx, I would say that that could be a Marxist way of thinking about it. The money makes them separate, different. Yeah. But I think it's also a cultural thing, a Gramscian thing, that it's often the culture of I am now a leader, I am now a boss. Now, cooperatives, for example, work on the basis that nobody is a boss and everybody is a boss. Okay, so one of the biggest cooperatives in the world is an organisation called Mondragon in the Basque country in Spain. And the Mondragon was established actually with the help of a Catholic priest who looked at the teaching of Pius X and said, capitalism's bad, communism's bad, now what? What do I do to make people's lives better? And he helped to create this company called Mondragon. In Mondragon, there are no capitalists, okay, but everyone is a shareholder. But there's always still a problem of the principal agent. So what they have is they have volunteer directors. So that nobody is allowed to go and be a director of the company and be off the shop floor. Okay? So when you make political decisions about the future and the strategy of an organisation, at 9 o'clock in the morning, you have to go back on the shop floor. So you're a director between 7 o'clock in the morning and 9 o'clock in the morning, and then you go back on the shop floor and you carry on working. And you have to justify your decisions to your colleagues. Whereas what we have is directors or bosses in companies stop doing the work, or do a little bit of work but not a lot of work, and therefore don't have to justify themselves to people directly. So cooperatives work on a very different idea that actually we as employees are the decision makers, and there'll be a vote, for example. Or it might be you as customers. So there are also retail cooperatives. So you have a vote. Okay, so if you are a cooperative member of the cooperative retail group, not employees, but you as customers get to decide the strategic direction of the organisation. So that's a retail or a customer cooperative rather than an employee cooperative. Yeah. So there's an economic and a cultural imperative to have that separation between the two. Going back to this idea that some environmental enterprises have been able to push against the rules or change the rules of capitalism, change the behaviours of capitalism. Particularly, I think, in the environment field, where it's much more likely that companies will want to protect the environment. In my own work experience, we were trying to get companies to protect the environment better, and of course they didn't think they're having a problem, and therefore they didn't see it was a problem. And they also saw that protecting the environment was expensive. So they said, we can't afford to protect the environment. It would mean that we'd be uneconomic. And it was when we started talking about waste minimisation to companies, we were able to say if you reduce the amount of waste that you create, you actually increase the amount of profit that you can make. And it was then that people started saying, actually protecting the environment benefits our profit margin. We can make more profit because we're reducing the amount of stuff we're throwing away. And then when the government introduced landfill tax and carbon credits and carbon trading and stuff like that, then it made those environmental goods much more expensive, and therefore it was much more profitable to be environmentally friendly.
If you look at situation in reality, you find out that people prefer to go to farmland rather than going to the corporate shop.
Yes.
Because the corporate shop cannot compete with some of these multi-billion companies.
Because it makes it more expensive. Yes. Because they're including, so what I've talked about here is social efficiency rather than financial efficiency. Yeah. If you go for a financially efficient company, it's much better for you to externalise, to move the costs onto somebody else outside the company, because it makes it more efficient. So if I don't have to pay for your pensions, it makes my company more efficient. So you have to pay for your pensions, so therefore you'll pay for it out of your wages. or the government will pay your pensions, so I'll pay a bit of it. So it makes it more financially. But an organisation like Mondragon or the Danwei in China have made themselves socially efficient by including all the social issues inside the organisation. So social enterprises can tackle those problems, but it's very difficult because you have multinational corporations who can undercut. So you need people to want to buy your social goods, your environmentally friendly goods. So back in the 1980s, there was very few people were buying recycled toilet paper, for example. How many of you buy recycled toilet paper? You want to put hands up? Anyone? One person? Anyone else wanting to volunteer buying recycled toilet paper? Actually, all of you buy recycled toilet paper now. Okay? All of you buy recycled toilet paper without knowing. Back in the 80s, when you bought recycled toilet paper, you had to be quite determined, environmentalist, to buy recycled toilet paper because it was special, it was expensive, it was rough, and it was a special colour, and you had to go to a special shop. You had to go to a Whole Foods shop to buy it. Okay? You couldn't go and buy it in a normal shop. But as people started thinking, do you know, it's a good thing to buy recycled toilet paper, and as companies started to think, do you know, it's actually cheaper to make toilet paper out of recycled paper rather than virgin pulp, actually all of the toilet paper you buy in the normal retail chains is all recycled. You go and have a look at the toilet paper at home on the packet and see how much of it is post-consumer recycled paper. Okay? Almost every one of them will be recycled toilet paper. So put your hands up if you think you're buying recycled toilet paper. All of you should be putting your hands up. So what's happened is the social norms, the cultural norms have shifted. That you don't think that it's essential, but you do it anyway. So what I'm trying to say is sometimes the enterprise, the type of enterprise we choose, the type of organisation, the company that we choose to use when we try our social innovation is in danger of being captured by the capitalism that we're trying to change, by the rules of behaviour that we're trying to change. So when we're starting our social enterprise or starting our social innovation venture, it's important for us to think through which bits of this organisation are we going to have to really work hard on in order to change or resist the cultural norms of behaviour. And that comes from it's not completely well thought through, but it comes from a long history of not just myself, about 15 other people around the UK, moving back to about 2005, 2006, who established the Manchester Critical Group. So it's not just me talking about this. There's lots of people in the social entrepreneurship world talking and thinking in these terms. And we go back to Saul Alinsky, for example. He's not just a simple community organiser. He's hugely problematic as a community organiser. Because at one level, he was working with the Catholic Church and the park director, who happened to be Catholic, to get separate communities, the Russian-speaking and the Bulgarian-speaking communities, to work together to overcome the separation that had happened between the two of them. But they also did this with the Packing House Workers' Union. But later on, he's hugely critical of the trade unions. And trade unions can be socially innovative, but they can also be hugely socially conservative. So it's not just a kind of trade union equals good, but it's to look at trade unions as a type of organisation. The work I was doing with my friends and colleagues in Poland, for example, they were looking at social enterprises and trying to understand what we might call a social enterprise in Poland just after the end of the Soviet Union. And actually they found the biggest social organisations were the old trade unions. Hundreds of thousands of people were members of the old trade unions, one of which is Solidarność. But on the other hand, a lot of them were really socially conservative or not being innovative. So they had this big problem on their hands. I report on this in my paper called Trust in 2008. Where they had a huge problem of actually establishing, there's millions of people involved in social enterprises in Poland, but they're not very socially innovative because they were part of the socially conservative communist approach to social innovation in Poland in the 1990s and the 2000s. So even Saul Alinsky, although he's very pro trade unions at some times, he's very against it because his focus is not on the organisation, but on the business itself, or on the innovation itself, So the way which we might summarise this is that unions on the whole, trade unions, represent, organise and solve. Okay? That's kind of what they do. They organise people, they represent people. They might actually be represented as a few people amongst all the workers, but they represent and they try to represent. You know, if there's 20 or 30% of people who are in employment who are voting in a union election, we might also look at how many people actually vote for a government at any one time. 20 or 30% of the population actually vote in a general election. So our MPs are just as representative as union representatives might be, we could argue. But what unions generally do is represent, organise and solve. Whereas what I'm suggesting in this presentation is actually we've also got to look at how socially innovative is this union, is this trade organisation, is this social enterprise for that matter. Social innovation, I think, investigates, it organises, and the same type of thing that we've talked about as Freirean and Alinskyite community organising, it also innovates and solves. So it doesn't necessarily use the traditional methods. And you could say, for example, lots of trade unions in the UK are trying to use techniques from the 60s and 70s to solve employment problems, whereas they could be using others. They could be using new techniques to solve those contradictions in there. But just as a bit of funniness, there was Michael Gove there, right, circled in that photograph back in when he was a journalist, member of the National Union of Journalists. He's government minister of education, secondary school education, but there he is. And those are the references for you to look at, and I'll put those on our site later.